supposedly said that if you want to know who rules over you, look at who you're not allowed to criticize. But on the other hand, it is legitimate to exclude people from conversations and private platforms in order to ensure a higher quality space for discussion and social exchange. But on the other hand, what counts as higher quality? And for that matter, what counts as a private platform? And how can we really trust our emotional reactions and our superficial reasoning about who to exclude? In the age of cancel culture and anti-cancel culture, I'm Layman Pascal for the integral stage Salon of the band, and I'm asking who gets threatened with exclusion and who should be excluded, who gets unofficially shouted down, and who disrupts the spirit of a discourse space. When are the platforms that enable communication complicit in attacking the very communication they're supposed to facilitate? Does the system itself or its major beneficiaries have a self-protection function that wants to deplatform, co-opt, or just turn the volume down on transformative ideas? What are the consequences of being excluded, slandered, suppressed, both for individuals and for the integrity of the new systems we're trying to set up? Helping me think through all of that today is someone who's felt the system pushing back at his ideas, Michel Bauwens. Is that how that's pronounced?
It's perfect and very rare.
We've got a little bit of French in Canada here.
All right.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you've been disrupted, excluded, or threatened with exclusion from conversation spaces?
Well, actually, for me, it's a bit the opposite in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm the founder of the P2P Foundation. And so we are kind of a research network and advocacy organization for what we call the commons. So any shared resource which is sustained by a community according to its own rules, which makes it different from the market and the state.
Right.
Let me also say, just so people know who's talking, I'm originally from Belgium, and in 2003 I moved to Thailand. I live in Chiang Mai. And, you know, it brings me around the world because I do a lot of lectures and stuff like that. All right. So just so people know who is talking. So I'm also a curator. That's very important. So I maintain a number of Facebook groups. One is called Open P2P, is the biggest one. It's about 7,000 people. And then 5-6 different ones. One in Flemish, one in French, and they, have varying numbers, probably together about the same as the 7,000. And what I noticed over time is a real degradation of discourse culture. And so what happened to me happened in August 2018. And, that was like a real kind of shock to me. I had basically ignored the identity politics. I didn't pay attention to it, and it's a bit strange because I'm like a full-time curator. I'm kind of famous for bringing new stuff to people, but somehow the signals that I've gotten, I just kind of like, oh, this is to me didn't make any sense. So I just kind of thought that's just a few people. And in August 2018, I started seeing Jordan Peterson. And I had a, kind of mixed reaction to him. There are things about him that I really appreciated. For example, his series on Jung and on comparative biblical narratives, so to be able to look at religion in a non-religious way, I find that interesting. So I could see he was somebody who was self-made, did his work, was very serious about his ideas. At the same time, he had like ideas about climate change and stuff that I felt very uncomfortable with. But my motivation was, okay, here's a guy who is getting so much attention, and he's attracting, amongst others, because people say this is the only thing, but like young males who feel in trouble and find some kind of meaning. And so I wanted to discuss this. And I just posted 2 critical videos. This is important. I posted 2 critical videos, one by Russell Brand and one by the California Institute of Integral Studies. And basically asking, why is it that the left, because I consider myself a leftist, I'm, for radical redistribution of wealth and for deep ecological transformation. why is it that the left, if you look at the podcasts and the stuff that you see from David Pacman and Michael Brooks, which I really appreciate, but they only talk about politics. Like, they don't seem to talk about any existential question that that affect people in their real lives, right? And so what I felt was that these people are then drawn to people like Jordan Peterson, and then they get a whole political program with it, which is not a progressive, necessarily a progressive program. So that was the issue that I wanted to discuss. And what I got instead of a discussion was this enormous explosion of hate and anger. And I was shocked because also the quality of the critiques were absolutely below par. So I was thinking about Salman Rushdie and a fatwa, and so millions of people want to kill him, but they've never read what he said. So this kind of idea that I saw all these people that I thought were my friends and comrades on the left no longer reacting to anything he said, but to what he imagined that he was saying. Like, there was almost no relationship between the kind of critiques. And so when I kind of gave counter energy to this, I said, no, he didn't say this. He didn't say, like, this is something you hear, that you have to force marriage at gunpoint. Like, he absolutely never said anything even remotely like this. What he said was, for example, marriage is a socially enforced institution, and monogamy works better than polygamy because it creates some kind of balance between men and women. So he didn't never said these things, right? And then I got really in the middle of this. What I didn't know was cancel culture. Threats, admonishments to stop speaking. Also, like, I'm a white person, so I'm not supposed to speak about certain topics. And so suddenly I got all this identity politics in one concentrated version. And to be honest, I never really got over this. And so what happened basically is that you then get canceled, but I control the forum, so they left. But then what happens is, like, once you target it, it's a whole circuit. So lost 2/3 of my income, got canceled in Berlin, in a conference, and so this kind of thing has been going on. And so what I see, and might be wrong, but so we live in a disintegration of the system, and there's a loss of trust in institutions. There's hyper anxiety about precariousness and all kinds of issues, ecology, climate change, collapse. And so I think people look for security, and so that's my view. They regress in terms of identity. And on the right, it will tend to express itself as ethno-nationalistic, religious, maybe fundamentalism, those kinds of issues. But I think on the left, definitely for me, it's it's this thing about identity politics and what kind of oppression I'm in, and these oppressions then create your identity and all the issues associated with that. I think that's just to lay the foundation of our discussion.
Sure.
This is kind of what happened. That was in August 2018.
I would assume you find this somewhat fascinating because your P2P work strikes me as looking at higher level collective processes. And this is a lower level collective process. So trying to understand what makes a healthy collective system versus a reactive swarm must really intrigue you, does it?
Yes. So the strength of the commons is that you have a shared social object, right? And some sociologists or anthropologists talk about object-oriented sociality. So let's take free software, which is a commons of shared software that is co-produced by all kinds of developers, some working, some not working, some volunteers. And what binds them is that they all want a working operating system, right? But the commons can be anything like that. It can be an open design for Arduino. It can be WikiHow. It can be a car. It can be urban commons. like getting organic food together and creating a provisioning system for organic food, shared mobility, shared habitat. I mean, it's, you know, wide variety. So what happens in a normal, well-functioning commons is that people transcend their differences because of this commonality. Like, I'll give you an example. I'm not very libertarian in the sense that, you know, in the sense of the American libertarianism, right? I don't think it's the right ideology, etc., etc. But when I'm working in a commons, let's say free software, I have to be able to work with a libertarian developer. And I think what you need to do in those specific contexts is bracketing some issues. You know, for example, if you go in a Masonic lodge, you know, they tell you no politics and no religion, right? Because they know that these are the fragmenting issues. Like once you start talking about this, people polarize very fast. And so in the commons is the same. You have to be able to say, okay, we're all peers, right? And I talk about equipotentiality. What does that mean? It means that you're not comparing people to people and say you're better than me, I'm better than this or that other person. No, what you're saying is we all somehow capable of co-constructing the commons, and each of us has some kind of unique capability that fits in this greater whole, right? So I can only judge you on your skill and maybe on your capacity to cooperate, you know, whether you're an a-hole or not, for example, right? So I think that's what works in the commons, right? However, if you have a priori divisions or hierarchy ranking, if you tell me I don't have a voice, I can't work on the commons, right? And I think this is happening. This is happening, and curiously, this is, in my view, now happening a lot on the left, where, you know, the kind of, you know about this, right? Standpoint epistemology and the intersectional ranking of. So when you start saying to people, okay, you're an oppressor, you cannot speak, then it's very difficult for me to enter in a relationship as a peer, because you're making all these assumptions about my intentions. And so when you have a theory that everything is power, right? That's very problematic. Not everything is power. Power is very important. Power is implicated in everything. But when you say you're the person because of your skin and you are only able to speak from your power and privilege, then I'm no longer a person, right? Which is the same as saying, oh, you know, you're an inferior person because of your race, which was, you know, the classical, maybe right-wing racism. Then, of course, you know, these could not be citizens, right? You're starting from. And I think this is very important. I think the commons is based on some idea of citizenship, right? Like that started with the Greeks and the Romans, the idea that we're all different, some are rich, some are poor, but when we vote, we equal as citizens, right? So I think in the commons is the same, although we don't use the term citizenship, but we use the term contributors. You know, if you contribute, you have a voice, right? So that makes the commons also selective in a way, right? And I don't know if you remember in Occupy, that was the rule, right? So there were all these old lefties on the side saying, no, these young guys are wrong, they should do it differently, you know. And the people inside the square, you know, and I was for a while in Zuccotti Park and in London, they would say, well, you know, contribute to Occupy, you know, in the working groups or on the square, and then we'll discuss in an assembly or whatever we can discuss. But you can't discuss from the outside. So that's also in the commons is that way, is that in order to have a voice, you have to be an active participant in the community. And, you know, that also is some kind of discrimination of sorts, but it's based on the idea that everybody can contribute. So it's basically your choice whether you want to contribute in that commons or not, right? And so that's also an issue with the commons, is it's based on affinity, right? On this joint love for some social object. Not everybody loves that object. Maybe there are cultural differences that make that some people don't like a particular subject. So I give you an example, Burning Man, right? I have my critique on Burning Man, but I also think it's a very interesting social phenomenon. And nobody is forbidden to go to Burning Man, and yet when you're inside Burning Man, it would seem that this culture attracts a certain kind of mentality, and there's relatively few people of color in Burning Man, right? There's no obvious discrimination. It's just that for some reason that is maybe difficult to understand, it attracts certain people. Now, I did a study on the commons in Ghent. It's a city with 300,000 people in the north of Belgium. And so one of the things we noticed is that you have two kinds of commons. And it was a real paradox. The civic commons, which are in theory open to all, in practice, were attracting the cognitive elite of the urban citizens. Usually people with a bit, at least 2 years university, these kinds of people would be attracted to this kind of voluntary commoning. What might be the case is that people who have less education, less capacity, extra time, because maybe they have two jobs, so volunteering is an issue. On the other hand, there were a lot of ethnic commons because the migration and already 2 or 3 generations of people that come from different ethnicities and organize themselves around their religion or whatever. There are by definition closed commons because they're only for Muslims or only for Bosnians or whatever. But in practice, they get all the people that the other commons don't get. So reality is unfortunately very, very messy. I don't know if that answers your questions. I'm just kind of
No, that's good stuff.
Talking about my world, but
it makes me very curious about the relationship between social factors and individual factors. You alluded to that at the beginning with the sense of what Jordan Peterson offers people that's left out of some of the left discourse.
Right.
And when we're looking at, like you are, the cancel culture aspect of identity politics in terms of the regressive movement on the left and the right, how much of that regression do you think is simply because of the factors around us, the factors of the economy or the type of media we're using and things like that? And how much of it depends on whether or not individuals make a moral choice to say, I want to be in a commons, I want to treat people as equipotentials?
Yeah, it's all of the above, I guess, right? So I think that it would be wrong, in my view, to blame everything on social media, right? Because fascism, happened in the 1930s, and they had radio, and maybe I don't remember the name of the guy in Florence in this 15th century or 16th century. He was a fundamentalist who took over Florence for a few weeks.
Savonarola.
Yeah. He didn't have radio, right? So I think we should be careful about this. So there is a social issue first. And the social issue, from my view, is that the future is blocked. If you're a young person, you can no longer project yourself in the future. Especially in the States, you start with student debt, and then you don't even sure that you find a job. You can't pay the rent, so you have to stay with your parents. In Italy, it's now 42 years on average. So young people stay home until they're 42. I mean, that's like unimaginable for my generation, right? So it's this kind of closing of avenues that I think is very important. And then the second level is social media. So social media has all these algorithms that add to it by creating all these filter bubbles, right? But then I think there's an extra step, which is, I consider, and I know this is going to be controversial, but I know other people have said it, like Pajot and Pastor Van der Clay, these kind of people. They say it looks like a bad religion, right? So I see it as an entirely closed system of thought. And I think that creates a very strong in-out group dynamic. And so what I noticed in the forums is several things. One is we're way beyond filter bubbles, right? Filter bubbles is like spontaneous, organic, the way people like affinity. That's, I think, normal. It might not be good, but it's kind of normal. You like to read stuff that, that kind of enforces your views. And I would be as guilty of it as anybody. Until I was shocked 2 years ago. I'll be honest. I was reading a New Statesman, but I wouldn't have bought a Spectator. Like, didn't see the need for it. So that's normal. But now it's so much worse, because once you're cultic about it, then it's not just organic. It's actually actively wanting to prevent divergent information, right? And so as a curator, I find that I'm under pressure. And that 62% of Americans believe they can no longer say what they think, right? And I have that. I have to think all the time, okay, is it worth the grief to put this or that in the forum? And then I'm always have these ethical issues, which is also what you alluded to, like, okay, do I want to be a courageous person and stand for what I really believe, even though, of course, I might be wrong? But it's just, I'm sincerely convinced about this. And, here is some kind of article that illuminates that issue one way or another. Or do I say, no, don't bother, it's going to create, conflict? And, do I really, if you spend, like me, a few hours a day on the social media, I mean, that's emotionally grinding. Like, that's not why I'm doing it. I'm not doing this to feel grief, right? I mean, you're feeling this because it's a skill I have, and I want to share with people, and I want to show them things they haven't thought about, right? Maybe you resonate with this. I think when you're an intelligent person, you hear somebody speak, you kind of hear what's missing in the story. Not because you necessarily disagree with that person or that you have the opposite point of view, but you say, well, have you considered this or that, right? It's kind of like, meta rationality or meta perspective. And, this is kind of an organic thing that I would do. And now it's very, very contentious, right? And this is specific to social media, as people project so much more. Like, they read something, they don't see the person. They think, okay, if you write that, that must be because. And so you have this kind of constant projection of intention on you. And then you say, no, I didn't, that was not my intention. And there's very little capacity to hear somebody say that. Like, no, that's what you meant. Okay, so I also wanted to say, so one other phenomenon that I noticed is not just like the content now, but it's the source that is becoming suspect, right? So let's say a lefty doesn't like the Wall Street Journal. People who like identity politics don't like Quillette and Iro magazine, right? And so there's this map of 32, or I don't remember, from Peter Lindbergh, this kind of memetic map of all these tribes. And all of them now have these forbidden sources. And to me, that's new. I mean, of course, the Vatican did it, some centuries ago, or maybe.
Do you think that's partly a necessary function of existing in an environment of information overwhelm, where people are faced with so many potentially meaningful signals, they have no choice emotionally but to really try to simplify where they can access information from and the kinds of reactions they're willing to have, because otherwise it's just too complicated?
Well, I don't know. Not for me. And actually, one of the things that happened to me, which is kind of, unexpected. So I started multiplying my sources. And in a way, I'm very thankful for these incidents, because I said, okay, I have to look at different things, and see. And so I've been in the discovery mode and I don't feel that personally threatening at all. I mean, I think I hear what you're saying, and this, I think, is the regression, right? Is that you have a certain level of complexity, and then there's this disintegration, fragmentation, but then instead of trying to go up a level of complexity where you can hold that difference, people go down, right? And that's to a lower level of complexity. And
People
that I
run
think,
into these stresses or
yeah,
conflicts
I
or
think
things
so.
that
That's, I think you're
either
right, but I don't
stretch the
think that's a good thing.
simplification or
I don't think that's a no. Yeah.
yeah. So you had a certain skill set or temperament that allowed you to take those hits and proliferate your information sources, whereas a lot of
Yeah.
people are going to regress to a simplification. So, what is that skill set? Is it possible to spread that, through, say, education to more people?
That's a difficult thing for me to say because in a certain way, to me, it came organically. First of all, I'm trained as a librarian. I was a reference librarian, I was a strategist, knowledge commons. I mean, basically my whole life. I've, worked for BP and big telcos and United States Information Agency and all kinds of stuff. And so when I created the P2P Foundation Wiki, which has 22,000 articles and 75 million page views, I said, okay, I don't believe in neutral point of view, right? So what I did is I used what I call opportunistic updating. So so there's a stream of stuff coming my way from my community, and I look for significant passages, and I construct an article, not by saying this is the way it is, but by saying, from different perspectives, you build an article over time, like in free software. Expect here. So it's kind of by definition multi-perspectival. And the idea that I have about truth, which might be wrong, but at least I think it works especially in like social science and everything, is you have an object, and by illuminating it from various perspectives, you see other things, right? And for example, my perspective is the commons. Because I'm so specialized in this perspective, I'm going to see things that a lot of people can't see. But then I meet a degrowther, and he's going to see things that I don't see, right? So my view is that you have an object that you want to understand as a person, and your perspective will illuminate certain things and create a shadow as well, right? And so the idea is that by combining multiple perspectives, you actually shine more light on the object. And so that's kind of an idea about truth that maybe doesn't work with hard science, but definitely works in terms of social objects, right? So that's kind of the idea also that I use in my wiki, which is a perspectopedia. And so the idea is I construct these articles not by saying this is how it is, but by quoting from various perspectives, and so creating this kind of ongoing construction of an article that is multi-perspectival, right? And of course, I'm certainly not perfect in terms of knowledge and stuff, but I do think somehow, maybe because of my training as a librarian, that is something that is quite natural. And I also think the only way to teach this is probably dialogue. And that's what's particularly problematic when you have a political tendency, which kind of preempts the dialogue by creating a hierarchy between people and making your perspective suspect so that you cannot express it. So that's both on both sides, of course, that exists, and that is very problematic. That is really difficult then, because how do you enter in dialogue if you're not a peer, right? And that's really problematic.
Well, here's the thing I'm curious about, which is some people like Jordan Peterson, for example, would associate the phenomenon of identity politics regression with postmodernism and then somehow connect that to progressive politics. And so there's this
Right.
idea that the virtues of modernity, which include things like free speech, humanism, and individualism, are being sabotaged by this new, more complicated philosophy. But at the same time, you could
Right.
say that cancel culture to some degree was always part of modernism, right? That there's suppression of information in business hierarchies, and anybody who doesn't do the correct public messaging for a corporation gets canceled from that corporation. So do you see it as a postmodern or a modern phenomenon that leads to this regression?
No, I see it as a permanent phenomenon. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with integral theory, and with the idea that you have first tier consciousness and second tier consciousness. And what makes a difference is that first tier consciousness, represses everything that's below it and everything that's above it. So if you're Christian, you repress the witches, but also the atheists. If you're an atheist, at some point, this was real, they repressed religion where they could, right? Or removed it, in a small corner of private belief or whatever. But there was always, so political correctness is not new. So I fully agree with you. It's every of these kind of constellations of consciousness has its own political correctness. And I mean, this is a working hypothesis, is that what's happening now is, well, what integral people call green, which is kind of the egalitarian idea, which is reaching some kind of hegemony, but somehow I would argue in a particularly toxic way. But then again, putting everything in perspective, if you were a witch in the Middle Ages, you'd burn at the stake, right? Here, you do lose your job, and we shouldn't forget that. They really campaign for people to lose their jobs, and they call up the bosses, they do all kinds of things. So that they do that, right? They go for your job. Okay, you lose your job. It's much less than being burned, right? So in that case, we should never be too. But I think compared to what we had, there is a regression. There is the overtone window, as they call it, like the amount of things that can be said is less now than it was 10 years ago. And I don't think 10 years ago, 62% of Americans would have said, "I'm afraid to speak my mind."
So
including
do you think
50%
that change,
of progressives.
is that change coming from an idea system, or is it coming from the media that we're using? Or are those two things downstream of political and economic phenomenon that are causing it?
Yeah, so I think that what you just said, you have, like a socio-cultural basis, and that gets complicated by a particular way our social media are functioning, by private companies who want to keep our attention, use polarizing algorithms. So that makes it worse. But I don't think that's the root cause. The root cause is the crisis of the system, the psychological disturbance, and the search for certainty in very uncertain times. I think that's the root cause. And that makes it so difficult to solve. And so the problem is, of course, that it kind of complicates the transition, right? If everything is fragmenting, then that's not a good way to change in a way. On the other hand, I'm a reader of Peter Pogani, Rethinking the World, and he has this idea that society is a complex adaptive system that can only change through chaotic transition. In other words, there has to be fragmentation before there can be a new order, right? And I think we are really in this downward spiral. And so the most positive way to interpret this, hopefully, is to say, regression in service of the ego, right? That, for example, a lot of people who did psychoanalytic therapy, whether you believe in it or not, but the theory was that you had to go back down to your roots and then reconstruct yourself, right? So there could be temporary regression in order to create this new order. That would be the most positive way to interpret it, and just accepting that before something new emerges, it has to go through this kind of pathology, which is more or less inevitable. But the whole idea of the commons, that I started when I started working on this, was actually to the opposite. Is okay, we know chaos is coming. How can we smooth the process, right? How can we avoid 1 billion people dying and maybe have a few million or a few 100,000 dying, right? And so my work is about mutualization, right? So you have an overshoot of humanity using too many matter energy resources, unsustainable. by pooling resources, you can actually go down 80% of thermodynamic usage, right? So you can keep very complex social processes with 80% less usage of matter and energy. Now, bring that to the psychological level. I'm thinking about the same. Can we find, commoning techniques, dialogic techniques, ways of talking together that can avoid? Because what's happening, and that's a danger, right? Democracy is based on the idea that you don't have enemies but adversaries. And the danger is that if this polarization goes too far, we're moving from adversaries into enemies. You cannot talk to each other anymore. Therefore, the only way to resolve conflict is through violence. So I think this is the challenge we are facing. And I'm not particularly good at that. But what I see is that people, let's take James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, who are not very much loved by these circles, but they're doing new discourses, right? So there's all kinds of people trying to get people back talking together. And
We've
I
got this
certainly think
situation
that's something that needs to be done.
where the breakdown could either be regressive or it could be the preparation for a new development, a new growth. And one of the things that makes that difference is whether or not we have this skill at doing better discourse with each other. And in order to do that, we have to practice it in discourse spaces, but those discourse spaces can be sabotaged by the very people who represent the regression. So who do we
this is my dilemma.
Exclude from? What are the rules of discourse space? Who do we cancel in order to allow the practice spaces for the discourse?
Yeah, this is my dilemma, because I have a rule in all my forums which is against racist speech for historical reasons, and because of probably my personal affinity. I always define the commons as a progressive project, right? Which means that we have almost no people from the other side. So I never had a single incident of racism from the right. I know it's there. I know these people are there, and I know they're bombing the Christchurch and stuff. I know they're there. Of course, they're not all like that, but I mean, I know there's an increasing level of radicalism and extremism. Okay, so. And that's my drama, is that for the moment, the only people who say to other people you can talk because of your skin are people that from the left identity groups. They are saying you can speak because you're male, and so I'm in this dilemma. I see this as a danger, but by saying it, I also create conflict, right? And so I'm still fighting with myself. About 6 weeks ago, I decided, okay, I just go for it, and I say what I mean. I say what I think, but then you're labeled, and so one of the things that I see is, so you have the right and the left. Historically, the last 3-4 decades, the right has moved ever more to the right in terms of market liberalism, right? And the Democrats, the left in general, the social democrats in Europe, just the same. They moved along, right? So by the time Obama comes to power, his policies are to the right of Bush, objectively speaking. But the Republicans are already so far more to the right that even Bush is no longer, seen as a Republican by people who love Trump, right? So, but in the culture space, the opposite has happened, right? You have the left-wing parties lost about 30 years ago. They're linked with the working class, and they became the party of the urban cognitive elite and all kinds of minorities, alliances of minorities. And they have moved to the left, or I don't know if that's the right word, but they've moved more and more radical on cultural issues, right? And so that means that being left or right is not like a fixed category, because these are categories that move, right? And so my problem now is that I'm not following the certain things that go in terms of culture wars. I'm no longer following, on that line, then it's easy to say, oh, oh, he's becoming on the right. I haven't moved. I'm in the same place, but the culture has moved, right? And so, but if you don't move in the same direction, you end up in a weird place where, like your two legs are moving in the opposite directions.
To what degree do you think the move toward cultural radicalism is almost a quasi-intentional move to avoid economic progress?
Yeah, that's a difficult issue. I think there are sociological trends. They're not necessarily intentional, right? I mean, they're just how society evolves. And as more and more people started studying, basically, I think organically in the cities, these people took over the left-wing parties. And, workers moved out of cities many times because they can't afford the rent. And it's not true in every city, but it's true in many, many different cities. And so, I mean, there's people on the left and the right who talk about this. So you have Thomas Piketty, that the guy who wrote Capital in the 21st Century. He's also done a really good work about electoral dynamics. And then you have a French guy called Emmanuel Todd and what's his name, Matthew Goodwin in the UK. They all come to the same conclusions. Basically, instead of two camps, we now have three. So you have the Brahmin left, the cognitive left, right? You have the merchant right, so the people with knowledge and the people with financial capital. And in between, you have the people who have neither. And right-wing populism is the capacity of the right to connect with the workers and create a new political majority on the right. I think that's what's happening in many societies, right? And the left is in a particularly difficult situation. It's, right now I'm despairing about this because they're not moving back to regain the workers. They're moving more and more, at least a big bunch of them are moving more and more, doubling down on the culture. But the more they do that, the more they lose this kind of, majority vote. And I don't want to bore you with this, but there's a lot of studies about this, right? That maybe I might give you one example just to show how this works. In Australia, Labour was going to win, like all the opinion polls. And 2 weeks before the elections, there's a rugby player who said something nasty about gay people. And he was evangelical, he was Polynesian, and they have certain prejudices, and he said it out loud. This was for 2 weeks on the front page of the newspapers. What do you think happens? Well, Labour lost 1.5 million Polynesian evangelical voters in 2 weeks, and they lost the election, right? So this phenomena is also true for Trump, where the fear of PC, fear of political correctness, is given as the second most important reason why people voted for Trump, right? And you have these 8 million Obama voters. It's hard to call them racist if they voted for Obama, who moved to Trump, right? They had their reasons, and so I think Trump is a particular bad case because he didn't keep his promises, and he made so many bad decisions. So hopefully he will lose. But you look at Poland and Hungary, where much more clever strategic leadership there, and they're binding the working class to this new politics. Because if you're the bottom 1/3 of the population, there was a study about this. These two countries, they made improvements. Like if you have 4 kids in Poland or Hungary, I forgot, you have like a lifelong basic income. Yeah. So they actually implementing socialist policies within a xenophobic, nationalist context, but they're doing stuff which the left is not doing, right? And this is really complicated. And so what drives me to despair is that the ones that try it on the left, like Bernie Sanders and Corbyn, do not seem able to pull it off.
Yeah, it's a very tricky situation because the left seems to, a lot of the left is actually very bureaucratic and conservative, and a
Yeah,
bunch of the left is also very focused on cultural radicalism, and those both could be side effects of this professional, higher cognitive caste kind of phenomenon. That leaves
yeah,
only a very small pool of left economic populists. And you'd say,
yeah.
well, maybe they could work with the right wing economic populists, but their temperaments and values are so different, it's hard to see how they could coordinate on anything.
Yeah, that's what Ralph Nader said for a long time already, and what, to my great surprise, Glenn Greenwald, you know him from Intercept, he's saying the same thing. But yeah, you have these huge issues that make that very difficult. There's some, like, don't know all the details, but I know, like in Denmark, the socialists actually became an anti-migration party, and that kind of jumped up their vote. Is that a good thing? You know,
I I
not in
don't know,
my
my
opinion,
personal
but
feeling. I tend to
yeah,
feel like the left has most of the answers on how the economic system should be restructured, but it has
yeah.
to incorporate more of a conservative flavor, has to speak that language more rather than just talking to its own people.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. You know what? That's one of the critiques of identity politics is that, okay, it's all about diversity, except viewpoint diversity, right? And you have these people saying, we want black people who think like black people. We don't accept black people who don't, so it's kind of this group thing that becomes predominant. And, they expect everybody then to react from this kind of group dynamic. And all this is at the expense of class. It's like diversity within the elite, like, dividing up the jobs of the CAOs. And, of course, I'm not against that, but that's not necessarily a left policy. That's a liberal policy. And, in my worst days, I imagine that, we're really seeing the kind of disintegration of the left, and that out of these ashes will have to grow something new. Because, right-wing populism is also not an answer, because you're I mean, if we get into resource wars, right? So diminishing peak resources, diminishing resources, and if these people, like, restart the nation state in a competitive viewpoint, that's bad news too, right? Because so what we need, and that's what the P2P Foundation is about trans-local and transnational institutions, right? So if you have, like, for example, a global open source community, that works in the whole world, right? And we're still weak institutionally, but take permaculture, right? I mean, I don't know how many projects there are, but there are thousands upon thousands in the world, and they are at the same time very local. They're with their foot in the dirt, feet in the dirt, but they are learning from this transnational learning community that is, really existing, right? So what I'm advocating is kind of to strengthen this part, to use the nation state as an enabler of these flows, right? So, and I give you an example. It might sound utopian, but this is the way I'm thinking about this. So in Ghent, we had a project that aimed to have 100% organic food for public school children, 5 million meals a year. It's already done in Copenhagen. So this is, there are places where this exists. So what you need to mobilize organic farmers in the bioregion of Ghent. You need cargo bikes, zero carbon transportation, and you need the cooks in the school. And you need the geeks who organize the platform and coordinate the platform, right? So I'm thinking, if you could convince progressive coalitions to implement those kinds of changes, right, where you have all the provisioning systems with the view of neutralizing them to avoid the human footprint and to protect from disintegration. And at the same time, you're actually rebuilding a social fabric where the different sections of the working class work together again. Because this is a drama. I used to work in an office in a telecom, and until 5 p.m., white and Indian people, because there's a lot of Indian people, doing, coding in telcos, right? And then at 5 p.m., some people start to go home, and the cleaning teams arrive, and there were in Belgium, they're from North Africa. That's like apartheid, right? That's like the physical difference between the people who work with knowledge and the people who work with their bodies, right? And so these are like objective social realities, and that's where you should work on, right? That's what I see as kind of progressive policy, is to unite, to create unity. And I think commoning is a way to do that. But the problem is, we're politically very weak. And, the left is still so wedded to its Keynesian presumptions. And the Keynesian presumption is value is created in the market, right? So we have to promote the market, which creates wealth, and then we're going to tax the wealth and redistribute the wealth. And then left and right have different opinions what to do with that. But the left basically agrees with that idea, right? Well, as you take a commons point of view, it says, well, value is everything that contributes to the common good of society. So suddenly care becomes valued, and every form of commoning becomes valued, and what we call externalities, which are not externalities, but we call them that way, become valued, right? So value becomes contributory, and then we start designing currencies and stuff that recognize all this new value regime. For the classic left, they can't understand this because they think, oh, but you're going to weaken the market by having more non-market. You see what I mean? So we have this dilemma. We have a difficulty of translating this paradigm in a way that politicians understand. And if you look at BLM and all the contemporary movements, they don't talk about the commons either. It's not at all part of their thinking. It's like a total blind spot. And that's, from my point of view,
do you think the liberal establishments can be moved in the right direction, or do you think ultimately progressives have to stop seeing liberals as their allies?
Well, it's a very difficult issue, because I tell you one thing: once you target it, yeah, and you need help, and who is helping you? Almost no one on the left is helping you. Brett Weinstein had to go to Fox News, not because he wanted to, because he was with Occupy and with Bernie Sanders, but he had to. And here, this might be provocative and you might disagree with me, but Ken Wilber said Jordan Peterson is integral. I don't agree with that, but I do want to make a relative point about this. Leftists think that Jordan Peterson is some kind of guy from the 50s who want to, woman in the kitchen. This is completely wrong. He's right wing. He's a liberal in the classic sense. He's conservative in many ways, but they have fully integrated the civil rights issues. Like, there's really no hint in him, if you really listen to what he says, that women shouldn't be working or that gays shouldn't have rights. Absolutely not. So in this sense, they have integrated a set of values. And if you're an integralist, which I assume you are, the thing is transcend and include, right? So a new level of complexity cannot just change everything, and has to take some things from the old system. Well, don't you think that free speech is something that we need to keep? I do. And so when people start deplatforming, that is very regressive. And then if the right wing is defending free speech, it's unfortunate, but that's actually what is objectively happening, right? So maybe, and this goes against what you're saying, is that maybe we should be rethinking alliances, and because I cannot work with people who deny my free speech. I'm sorry. How is that going to work? You see the problem, right?
So what does it
I
take?
can
Like,
see, I can
other
see,
than that
yeah,
idea, right? We start go, okay, I've got to accept people with different values and ideas. I might be looking for new kinds of allies, but that's still a difficult thing to do. What does it take from us emotionally to be able to work with people we disagree with?
yeah, it's it's very difficult. Uh, but I mean, one of the positive outcomes of my crisis was that I actually started listening to these people, and that I can now understand their concerns. I can understand their fears. I can see them as human beings instead of as political adversaries, right? And I find it actually liberating. But politically, it's still very difficult because they're not very moved by climate change. Some of them are a little bit, but in general, this is not their issue. All of them are pro-capitalist. Now, I actually do accept the market, but I think capitalism is a particularly problematic form of the market. So you see, we have a lot of issues, and I have no idea how we're gonna, rearrange this into something workable.
It seems like a lot of large liberal corporations, and particularly the ones that control a lot of the social media platforms, are very happy to promote cultural issues which leave their power intact. And because they provide the platform for all the rest of our speech, we're in a very vulnerable position to bring forward anything against that.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, that's another thing we didn't discuss, but the platform censorship now is really problematic. And lately I discovered that I cannot answer people. Like, the comment field is disabled. And I thought it was a glitch, but there's an article about it. This is like they're experimenting with algorithms that regulate who you can talk with, right? And another incident I had recently was I shared an article from a commons-based progressive think tank about pharmaceutical commons, because COVID, the vaccine, it's a big issue. If it's a privatized vaccine and how much it will cost. So the idea to do like Salk with polio, to have a commons vaccine, right? It was censored. And it was censored because something in the quote triggered the algo. I don't know exactly what, because the problem with Facebook is there's no way you can go with your complaints. You're just, fait accompli, always, And so I had a warning, both as my feed and as a forum administrator, that I'm on their warning list, because somehow the algo interpreted this as a opposition to vaccines, right? So they're making all these mistakes. And the problem is, again, and it might seem a bit unfair, but I believe this is true. The pressure for censorship is coming from the left right now, very little from the right. So Facebook is then reacting, to this establishment and introducing more and more censorship. What a mess.
What a mess. That's a good note to end on. What a mess.
Yeah. Yeah.
This has been a lovely conversation, Michel. I've had a nice time.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm kind of volatile, as they say, so
I
anyway,
know there's a lot of people in the community online who are peripherally aware of you. And this will help them get a better sense of where you're coming from on things. But also, I just had a nice time.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And you're doing great work. It's, when I look at your podcast, I'm amazed at the richness of the Integral movement. I don't think that was the case 10 years ago. So there is some maturation there. I think maybe we're finally starting to make a difference in some ways, because I always critique Integral being too far removed from action. And maybe you don't know this. I just want to end with this, Pascal. So the P2P Foundation was actually an integral left project. I was part of the Integral Institute Politics remotely because I was in Belgium at the time and working with people like Greg Wilpert and others. And we found that, Wilbur, in our view, then was too neoconservative and that Integral was too far removed from action. And so we actually, created the P2P Foundation as an integral left project.
Yeah, that staggered a little bit still, but I think we got it. The audio was clear.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Michel.